in the pandemic there to live.
And you started to live there.
And then, yeah, and now I'm trying to see if it works. I travel twice.
So the university is in Santiago.
Sorry?
Your university is all.
My university is in Santiago, yeah. But I teach only 1 day a week. The rest of the time I just.
Yeah. So
Huh?
Where? I'm Chilean.
You're Chilean? Oh, from Adolfo Ibañez University.
Yeah, but we're in the beach.
Oh, in Chile.
I'm Chilean. I'm from Melipilla.
From Melipilla. Oh, nice. I traveled to Melipilla every day. Yeah. So, what? But okay, from Melipilla, where did you do your undergrad?
In
La Católica, and then a PhD here.
yeah.
Do you work with Milan?
No.
Okay.
But
he's an economist.
Okay.
Okay, so should we start?
Yeah.
Okay, so
We're recording here.
Oh,
so the recording is,
Can I take it off for presentation?
sure, I think so. Welcome. My pleasure to introduce Daniel Quero, is an associate professor in the Faculty of Engineering, and let me get this right, at the Adolfo Ibañez University, UAI. He's also the director for Center for Energy Transition there. He has 12 years of experience in various scientific studies, techno-economic analysis of the electricity sector. He holds a electrical engineering PhD from, or electrical and computer engineering PhD from the University of Waterloo, and has worked on complex systems, solar energy research. His work focuses on the development of control schemes and computational models and tools for efficient planning of energy systems, and in particular work related to renewables, solar and wind. So thank you, Daniel, for coming here all the way, and apologies for the rather tepid response we have.
that's totally fine. No worry. Thank you, Milan. So I'll take this chance to also introduce the center, the Center for Energy Transition at UAI. So the mandate of our center from the presidency of the university is to develop research and development relevant for and in partnership with the public and private sectors, and to maximize impact on society. The university actually closed all the centers last year, and they reopened because they had to reformulate all the activities to comply with this mandate. Okay. So our mission as a Center for Energy Transition is to conduct and transfer interdisciplinary research that allows society to advance an energy transition towards economical, environmentally friendly, socially acceptable, and reliable energy demand and supply. And we aim to become a benchmark for this type of work and activities in Chile, but also internationally. So we divide our activities in multidisciplinary challenges. This is just might seem like a small detail, but we actually think it's important to focus on challenges rather than areas of expertise, which is the common what you observe in other research centers. So we have 4 large challenges which are aligned with the objectives for sustainable development from United Nations. One of them is clean fuels. Chile has developed a very ambitious strategy to become one of the main suppliers of green hydrogen in the world. So we have many projects dealing with the supply chain of green hydrogen, production and transportation also, which is one of the most important parts. We also have a challenge associated with sustainable and resilient energy supply. Chile is subjected all the time to natural catastrophes, mainly earthquakes, as you may know from news, but also floods, rains, and cold weather now every time more strong, and heat waves as well that produce forest fires in the south of Chile. Our third challenge is sustainable industry 4.0, which is associated with all the challenges of converting processes to clean fuels. And then sustainable energy cities and communities, which is associated with the challenges of producing and consuming local energy in microgrids or small towns in an efficient and secure way. So this is our current base of researchers. They are all faculty at the Adolfo Ibañez University, and we are focused on different areas of expertise. We all work together in the projects, but many of our researchers focus on regulation and markets. Some of us also, including me, modeling of energy systems. And we have also, especially newer faculty members, which focus on the development of prototypes for PV cells and wearable electronics and all that type of research. So our strategy to accomplish these goals are, we actually have many activities, but I want to focus on the first two because I think are what we are putting all our efforts on developing. The first one is what we call the Centra Industrial Research Chair Program. Actually borrowed that from Canada. You have industrial research chair programs in Canada. In Chile, it's not that common to approach a company to try to solve a specific research question, but very focused on their process. Okay, so it was an experiment and it was successful. We started the first one, like we launched the center earlier this year. We started the first industrial research chair program right away with an association of local distributed generation producers. They wanted to see which were the challenges of and barriers that they face both technically and regulatory to develop the industry efficiently. And we are about to start the second and third industrial research chair program. These are 2 to 3 years researcher programs funded mainly by the private sector. Then the second point is the project UAI, Intelligent and Carbon Neutral Campus by 2030. This will allow us to build living labs on campus. So the idea is to test new technologies, to provide training to people from industry that want to work on those technologies, and also to offer newer labs to our undergraduate and graduate students at our university. Okay, so let me start by just giving a brief motivation to decentralize energy solutions. So if we ask in the past what constitutes value of energy supply, many people would have just answered, the ones that knew like about the electricity supply would have said, okay, so in the past, what constitutes value is kilowatt hours, cheap kilowatt hours, and system security. That's all that matters. We develop our systems based on those two goals. So the decision model for that value is to generate kilowatt hours at minimum cost and comply with security constraints. That's very consistent with the centralized management or decision making in the system. If we ask that today, we would say, okay, kilowatt hours, cheap kilowatt hours is of course goal, system security, but also low greenhouse gas emissions has become a goal. A low intervention of ecosystems has also become value in electricity supply. So the decision model for that is to generate now kilowatt hours of minimum cost, complying with security and environmental standards that we have set for those purposes. Right? This is still largely consistent with the centralized management in the energy sector. But what about the future? I have some questions here. I don't have the answer, but we still have the same as before. We have kilowatt hours, cheap kilowatt hours, low greenhouse gas emissions, low intervention of ecosystem, system security. Not so sure, and many could argue, but do we need to secure to have system security as a system level at the system level, or maybe we need to provide security of supply more locally? Are we going to value local production of energy? Are we going to value self-generation? We're going to value resilience against catastrophes, or maybe other sources of value that will appear in the future and that will shape the way we decide how we build our energy systems. So the decision model for this is unknown. That's where we are trying to figure out. We're adapting our decision models all the time and also deciding who should take the decisions. This is hardly consistent, in my viewpoint, with the centralized management and decision making, because many of these constraints are very low. So you raised your hand.
You're trying to understand your definition of system security. What do you mean by that?
Also, system security is to maintain a supply of energy, resisting. Typically, the standard is single contingencies in the supply
So,
system.
but the distinction here is, you want to do it in a centralized manner initially across all places of demand, whereas in a more distributed setup, then you can evolve that security down to the lowest.
Exactly, because the way we do it is we set these standards and we apply them when we plan the transmission system, the nationwide system. Right? Do we need to apply those constraints at that level, or maybe leave that for lower level structures? That's the question. Okay, so that opens the question whether we should be decentralizing the investments and decision making and operation of our systems. And this also comes with other advantages. The first one that we can mention is modularity and adaptability of the decisions. Right? Modularity, because of course, when we build decentralized, in this case, electricity production systems, these are a few kilowatt systems. They are built within a week. And decision, like the financing is highly decentralized. Like basically, every consumer can take the decision of where to install, when to install, how much to install. And it's also adaptable in a way that as we can build them very fast in case of we foresee a shortage of energy within a year, we can quickly build systems to supply locally the energy. It's also there are also advantages in terms of local industry and new business models. And this is not something that we can predict, but it's something that we can already observe in some parts of the world. That where we see a higher or a stronger development of distributed generation, we have also seen emerge different business models, like local exchange of energy and local energy markets, people exchanging energy and money locally, providing security, sort of crowdfunding investment in storage or production facilities. And also we see more higher resilience. And this is not something that will happen automatically if we decentralize our production, but it's something that can happen because we have so many more controllable assets in the system that we can manage to supply energy locally in cases of emergency. And due to these advantages that we can observe in the centralized energy system, we have observed also global trends in the development of decentralized solutions. The first one is microgrids and local markets. This started maybe 20 years ago, basically as a solution to supply isolated systems that were highly based on diesel, and diesel logistics are an issue. So if we can produce electricity locally with solar panels or wind turbines, that was valuable, right? But now we are starting to think of building microgrids within larger grids as a way of maintaining supply and security locally when a large disturbance occurs. And maybe, as you may know, many large companies like Siemens, ABB, Hatch are working towards developing solutions for microgrids. We have seen some examples as well in the world. We have the as you may know, the Brooklyn microgrid, which is an experiment, mainly financial exchange between customers in Brooklyn, in New York. There's a company called Van der Bron in the Netherlands. It's sort of an Airbnb of energy. You can see who's producing, how much energy. They tell you, okay, we do this in our farm. We provide value to our neighbors through this and that activities. So you can decide based on not only the price, but also who is the person who's selling and how they are producing there.
There's a lot of such work in India as well.
Okay.
With microgrids.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And they also have to set up the infrastructure. They have to make sure that it doesn't get stolen. There's a whole bunch of innovation that comes in for very localized solution.
Yeah.
These are not grid connected.
Yes. And also last time I read about it, I know in India in many places you have reliability issues as well. You get power outages all the time. So this is an efficient solution for that now. Not in the past, but now it has become efficient to solve the reliability problem locally.
But these microgrids are by definition able to be larger system, like to sell the supply to.
So, okay, so by definition, a microgrid is a cluster of generational loads that can operate in a coordinated way to supply the energy locally, even without support from an external grid. Okay, so you might have a case, special case, an isolated microgrid that never connects to another larger grid, but you can have a grid-connected microgrid that in normal operation operates in coordination or connected to the main grid, but it can isolate if there is an issue with the main grid. And the third global trend that I can mention, and it's also something that is happening by private decision nowadays, is demand response and demand aggregation, which is basically coordinating demand of electricity, especially flexible demand, which are non-essential lighting or heating and cooling systems that you can play a little bit with the timing of when to heat and when to cool, and to manage that flexibility to provide services to the main grid. So how can you provide services to the main grid? One of the issues with renewable is that they are variable, and they have daily variability and second-to-second variability as well, and then you have seasonal variability. For the minute to minute and second to second, you might use air conditioning, non-essential lighting, and all sort of flexible loads to manage that variability. But you can also accommodate the load at the times where energy is cheaper in the large energy markets. So those are two purposes that you can aim at with flexible loads. Nowadays, most of the demand response aggregators provide ancillary services to the system, which is basically disconnect large chunks of load in times where there is an emergency or a security issue in the system. Okay, so now I'll show you with all these. As you may know, Chile has a very large potential for the deployment of renewable energy, especially solar in the very north of Chile and wind in the very south. So the question here is it more efficient to produce very, very cheap, probably the cheapest renewable energy production in the world, in the very north and in the very south, and then build the transmission lines towards the center where the load is? Or is it more efficient to have a lower plant factor, lower production, but to produce energy right where the load is? Right, that's the question. And the models that we use in Chile, they cannot answer that question because, yeah.
So, it's always been a puzzle to me that there's probably a simple economic answer, but we seem to move things like coal, very heavy things, away from the mine and produce electricity somewhere else, rather than produce electricity at the near a coal mine and then move the electricity. And what is the logic there, you think? Why do we do one and not the other?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's, the response must be economic. I mean, at some point it's cheaper to transport energy as electricity as to use instead of using trucks. To approach.
Maybe it is the transmission losses are large enough over time that it makes sense to just move coal. I've always wondered why we have coal. Then electricity is easier to move.
Large coal production plants in Chile are all right next to what do you call a port.
Oh, I see.
Right, so because it makes economic sense to bring the coal in a ship, but then not transport it by a truck anywhere else. You have to produce it there, and also you need water in the production process as well. So it's good to be near to the sea. Okay, so our hypothesis was that this was a very valuable resource, maybe significant in the planning of energy in Chile. It was not being taken into account, And basically because the models we use cannot take it into account because they don't model distribution networks, they don't model medium voltage transmission networks, they only model large high voltage networks. And typically the process is sequential. So we say, okay, this is the generation we need. And then, okay, let's build the transmission we need to accommodate that generation. It's not a co-optimization. So because of all of that, of course, the solution is going to be large scale production facilities which have the lowest cost possible per kilowatt hour, right? But if you co-optimize and also account for the fact that you can save transmission because of producing locally, maybe the answer is not the same. So with that question, we adapted the model that we call the NEWEN model or new M model. Works both ways because it's or either new energy or NEWEN, which in Mapudungun force or power, right? NEWEN. Although because of all the protests that happened in Chile a couple of years ago, you've seen NEWEN written in all the walls in the city. So maybe it's not a good name now. It sounds like we're protesting against something, right?
Sorry?
We name my son. Noel.
Oh, that's why you changed. Okay, so we analyzed the development of distributed generation in Chile from a central planner view. The same as we do with large scale power production plants, but we included the decision of installing distributed generation as well from the central planner perspective. Okay. And we also analyzed what happened with the jobs. And for that, we used an external software, which is called the JEDI software. They developed it in the US, I guess in LBNL. It's called Jobs, Economic Development, and the I forgot. Okay, but I'm not going to concentrate on this. Actually, the answer we got is that it doesn't make much of a difference to develop distributed versus large scale because you're just building renewables either locally or in large scale. So you get more jobs if you do it distributed, but it's not a big of a so I'm going to concentrate on the other part, which is simulating what happened with the electricity system and what is the optimal investment. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the new M planning model. We developed this starting from the switch model, which is a model for energy planning that they built in Berkeley, in the group of Dan Kamen. And then I think they are using it in LBNL nowadays. We actually upgraded quite a bit the switch model. We included a transportation model for transmission. We included some constraints related to short-term operation, which has to do with the unit commitment problem in power systems. And we uploaded all those upgrades to the website. So now if you go and download the switch model, you will see some of the upgrades that we provide. So the aim of the model is to determine the optimal investment decisions from the central planner perspective in a long term, say 20 to 30 years. Okay. What is the optimal investment plan is deciding which and where and when to build power production facilities and where and when to build transmission assets. And we project demand growth that we have to satisfy. It is capable of capturing some short-term dynamics with a high level of detail. And this is what I mentioned earlier, is the unit commitment constraints, which is deciding when to start up or shut off a production unit, which is a binary decision, basically. So once you turn it off, you have to keep it on for a few hours. And then if you turn it off, you have to keep it off for a few hours. And to model that, you need binary variables in a model that otherwise is linear. So we typically avoid including those constraints in a large-scale planning problem because it makes it non-complex, right? But we found a way that is very tight to model those constraints with linear constraints.
So these are the like hours, time scale of hours embedded inside
years.
A 30-year.
Exactly. Yeah, but we don't model all the days in the period, right? We use representative days to model. So each planning stage is represented by a number of representative days, which in the case that of the study that I'm going to show is 6, right? But the model is highly customizable, so you can change the number of days to represent the investment period to whichever number you want. Right? No guarantees that will converge, but you can set it the way you want.
So each day is year 1 representative day, year 5, year 10 is that's the kind of approach.
Yes. We have a hydro network, which is very important in the case of Chile. The hydro network supplies nowadays around 20 to 30% of the electricity. So it's very important to model all the constraints that those reservoirs are subject to, because they are what we call the irrigation agreements. So you cannot use all the water just for power production. You have to save some for irrigation. Okay, so basically the model does this, right? Decides which power plants to build, which lines to build, how much power do these lines have to transport, and also how to operate them within the representative days each planning stage. And then we have a model of Chile. So Chile is a very long country. This is cut into 3 sections. It's actually much longer than this, but the central interconnected system goes all the way up to Puerto Montt. We still have a few thousand kilometers south until the Antarctica, but the system, the main electricity system goes all the way to Puerto Montt. We model the system with 20 nodes, which is a typical way of modeling the Chilean system. It's not a simplified version. It's the same version that the Ministry of Energy will use for the long-term planning. So this is not a toy model. It's the state-of-the-art model. We have 137 existing power plants and other 209 candidate units, generation units. And the transmission system is represented by 23 corridors, which can be expanded in time to accommodate more generation.
So there's no exchange with, say, Argentina or...
We don't. We just have exchange of gas. We have pipelines where we produce all the energy locally. We're starting to interconnect with neighbors, Peru in the north, Bolivia, and Argentina, basically to produce more renewable power and exporting, because we can produce eventually 20 times what we need efficiently. Okay, so this is just a picture that depicts the way we model the reservoir system. We have also nodes and edges that in hydro system, like connecting power plants. Sometimes not all the decisions of the power plants, hydropower plants, are independent. Sometimes you produce in a large power plant upstream, and then with the plant downstream, you can only produce with the water that comes in after producing with the other one. So it's a tricky system. It has to be modeled. So we have used this model several times. We have actually done studies for the Ministry of Energy with this model. We have done studies for the National Energy Commission, for private companies, and we have also reported the results of the model in several papers throughout the last 5 years or so. There are like maybe 6 or 7 graduate students involved in the development of this software, and it's open source. You can download it, and it's actually state of the art. It's very interesting. Okay, so but the model as I presented it is not good enough to model investment in distributed generation, because we only have 20 nodes, and those nodes represent high voltage nodes, say 500 kV nodes or 220 kV nodes. So what we did is to open each of the main nodes in the system into 3 different nodes. We added an intermediate node that represents high voltage distribution systems, which is typically in Chile 23 kV buses. And then we have a bus representing low voltage distribution systems. This is a house, right? All the houses. in an area. And we have lines connecting each of these nodes. Luckily, in Chile, we run studies every 4 years that help us determine with high accuracy what's the cost of installing zonal transmission system, as we call it, and high voltage distribution systems as well. So we run studies in different areas of the country to determine how much money per kilowatt does it cost to build those segments of the transmission system, right? So in the low voltage distribution system, we can install residential distributed generation. We can also install distributed storage. In the high voltage distribution system, we can install what we call PMGD or PMG, which are large distributed generation power plants, up to 9 megawatts of installed capacity. We have demand from large industrial consumers in this past, and we have demand from commercial and residential consumers in the other, right? So we basically expanded the model. We created more nodes to accommodate DG decisions. And we studied several cases. In the base case, we assume that all the distributed energy resources are installed because of a central planner decision. So we didn't have a sort of consumer decision model, which is typically in this kind of models as well. We assume that a curve of consumer adoption. We don't have that. Like if it's sufficient from a central planner perspective, we install it. Do you have a question?
No. I'm trying to follow you.
Okay. We also assume, and this comes from a previous study, that the hosting capacity of low voltage networks is up to 30% of their peak load without any significant investment. Let's say if we have a transmission distribution feeder that takes 9 megawatts of load, we can install 3 megawatts of generation in that feeder, and we won't have to analyze it. We won't have to upgrade the wire. We won't have to install voltage controllers or anything. It costs zero, up to 30%, which is very conservative. Actually, it's a very conservative constraint. Some colleagues were saying that even 50% is perfectly feasible with no investment, additional investment. But we actually wanted to make the point to the ministry and to the private sector, so we were very conservative in our assumptions. We also consider a decarbonization plan for the electricity system, which in Chile means phasing out coal, not phasing out gas as well, just coal, by 2040. And we assume in the base case a medium trajectory of electricity demand growth and costs of investment. At that time, this was done in 2020, so those data are from 2020. Yes.
So how does the model like deals with demand projection, in particular substitution of fuels? Like I'm thinking, for example, like the use of firewood in the south of Chile, and if there is some sort of trend in the model that shows some transition to cheaper electricity to be for these areas.
So all those trends are exogenous to the model. You have to set them as scenarios. The model doesn't decide which is the efficient trend, right? We did run some scenarios where we converted all the firewood used in the south of Chile for heating into electricity. I don't think I have specifics of those scenarios here because we did another whole study regarding that issue, right? But it's exogenous. The model doesn't decide itself what's sufficient to convert to electricity. We also have technology scenarios. The first one regarding DR integration, we let the system decide how much is efficient, but we also run two cases forcing integration to be 50%, and another one forcing it to be 100% of the hosting capacity available in distribution. We also run a case where we force it to be zero. Like we wanted to see what happened if we keep all the barriers for the efficient development of distributed generation and no new relevant DG investment are done in the system. How much more does it cost to the system? But DG investment is occurring in Chile, so this is not happening anywhere. Right? It's just a fictitious case, a worst case. We also have renewable integration scenarios. We have a scenario where we decarbonize the system by 2040, but then we also have an accelerated scenario where we decarbonize by 2030. And we also include a scenario where we have 100% renewable production by 2040. That's no coal, no gas, no anything with fossil fuel.
The decarbonization is referring exclusively to coal, and then the next step
Is always, yeah, exactly. And we run sensitivities on key parameters of capital costs, demand growth, and other relevant. There are some transmission projects in Chile that were under discussion at that time, whether it was efficient or not to install them. So we run cases with and without those projects, but they're not that relevant to demonstrate the point here. The sensitivities on capital costs and demand growth are the same sensitivities that the Ministry of Energy uses when they run what's called the long-term energy planning process. By the way, this is all indicative for the Chilean electricity sector, right? The government or the state doesn't decide which plants to install. These are private decisions. This is only to inform whether the system is developing in an efficient way, or whether we have to introduce changes to the regulation because something that seems efficient is not happening in the market. We define this parameter, which is called the net differential benefit, just to compare the different sensitivities. So what we did this is to this is actually percent. So this is divided by what CCC is the base case total cost. This adds production or operation and investment in net present value of the case where we let the system decide what's efficient, whether it's distributed or large scale, which transmission system to build, with a base case scenario of costs, right? So this is the base case scenario. And then the second is the other scenario that we're comparing against. For example, a scenario where we force 100% of distributed generation, or we force them to zero, or we reduce the investment cost, or we increase them. Okay. So this will appear in a table later. These are the overall impacts that we observed in the system. First, the base case results show that the efficient DG integration in low voltage distribution nodes accounts for 62% of the total hosting capacity. So we allow them to install up to 30% of the capacity of the feeder. And in all the feeders, on average, in the country, that hosting capacity was used up to 62%, okay, which is very high. That's nearly 1.12 gigawatts of solar PV in low voltage networks. That's mainly rooftop solar. Okay. Also, in the base case scenario, we observe an efficient integration of nearly 1 gigawatt of storage, also at low level, low voltage networks. These are standard 4-hour storage. So 1 gigawatt of storage stores 4 gigawatt hours of energy, which is also very high. We were surprised when we observed these results. And then when we saw what happened in the high voltage distribution network, remember that we have the bulk power system node, then we had a high voltage distribution network node, and then we had a low voltage distribution network node. In the high voltage distribution network node, we observed 5.1 gigawatts of DG by 2040, and nearly 2.7 gigawatts of storage on addition. The efficient integration of DG in low voltage and high voltage distribution networks reached 6.22 gigawatts by 2040 in the base case, and that's 40%, almost 40% of all the new generation that the model installs between 2020 and 2040. So we have a resource here that represents 40% of all the new things that we have to build to supply energy to the Chilean electricity system in the base case. Here we observe what happened with storage. So the model installed nearly 12 gigawatts of storage, most of them in the bulk nodes, bulk power system nodes. This is because of the very cheap solar production in the north. So in order to avoid expensive transmission, the system invests in storage so that it can use more the existing transmission lines. One thing is that this high penetration of storage in distribution, low voltage and high voltage distribution, is likely to have a positive impact on the hosting capacity, right? Because the hosting capacity can be even higher if we can manage to consume the energy when it's needed, and we don't have to inject back to the system at times where the load is low, but the energy production local is high. So we reverse the flows, right? If we don't reverse the flows, we can accommodate even more distributed generation. This is something that we didn't predict at the beginning. So one of the sensitivities of this study that we want to run now is, okay, what happens if we free this constraint of 30% hosting capacity to whatever we want? Maybe we will see more. Actually, what we observed in Chile is that Concepción, which is a city south of Santiago, all the way to the north, the hosting capacity was installed 100% anymore. And to the south, you see 0 or 50 or something. But in most of the nodes where you install, you saturate the hosting capacity. So if we increase the hosting capacity, we believe that that's going to mean also a much higher penetration of distributed generation. We didn't observe many changes in terms of total CO2 emissions, because when we basically all the sensitivities exchanged investment in large scale renewable versus low scale renewable. So in terms of emissions, it was about the same. And this table shows a summary of all the scenarios that we do. So the results are in millions of US dollars of the operation and investment cost of the system. This is the cost for the base case. Don't look at the numbers, it won't make sense, but the difference is too big. So when we forced 50%, the cost was $1 million. Right? This is within the optimality gap of the model. No meaningful difference. And this is actually because of the base case installs already 65%. So when we force them to install 50, it's actually less than what the efficient installation. When we force them to install 100% of the hosting capacity, the cost also remained also the same, $5 million in net present value over 40 years of operation, or 20 years of operation. So basically, it's the same cost to install all the DG capacity that we can with the 30% hosting capacity. We can install them all of it, and it's still efficient or within the optimality gap of the efficient solution. Then one interesting case is when we force them to install 0 DG. What happened? The cost increased 2%. This is huge. This is huge. In the 2% in the operation of the system is tremendous. It's actually, or here it says, right? It can go up to this is American billion, right? $1.5 billion extra cost for all the taxpayers if we don't allow this to happen in an efficient way. Right? And then I will discuss what can prevent this from happening. If we accelerate decarbonization by 2030, we have to pay an extra $1.6 billion in net present value. If we accelerate decarbonization by 2030, and on top of that, we apply 100% renewable by 2030, we have to pay also $1.7 billion. So these are almost the same. So to decarbonize by 2030 is almost the same as to decarbonize and 100% renewable. So no gas. No coal and no gas by 2030 is almost the same as no coal only, because storage gets so cheap at one point that is cheaper to produce renewable plus storage than gas-fired power plants.
So that's just natural gas difference right there.
That's natural. Yeah.
So no fuel oil, no diesel,
No diesel, no gas, no carbon on this. Right.
Yeah.
Actually, the projections, of course, have higher impact on the results than deciding to decarbonize earlier or later. Well, these differences don't make sense because we're changing the demand growth. So of course, it's going to be cheaper if the demand growth is lower. Okay, so these are the results. We showed these to the Ministry of Energy, and we said, okay, what do we do now? We have a resource here. When you plan the transmission system, you plan to accommodate the efficient hydro, efficient gas, efficient large-scale PV, large-scale wind. But then I'm showing you here that we have a result that tells you that 40% of all the new generation is distributed, and you're not planning distribution systems and zonal transmission systems and the bulk power system to accommodate this. Right? So you're leaving a resource that is very efficient out of the picture. One interesting result here as well is that in this case, forced 100% DG, it means that 60%, which is almost the same cost as the base case, means that 60% of all the new capacity in generation between 2020 and 2040 is distributed. Sorry. My English is a little bit rusty.
That's an amazing large number.
Yeah.
Right? Because in most discussions, distributed generation is a footnote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or they use a customer adoption model.
That's right.
And it's exogenous. But then we're seeing that we have to plan it as any other power plant, and we have to secure financing for those decisions to happen. Because we're working with the international development banks and World Bank to secure financing for large power plants. Why aren't we doing the same for these small scale investments? So we have in Chile, for this to happen, we have some structural barriers and some other non-structural barriers. Right? So the structural, which are in the law, the first one is that the zonal transmission system, which is the transmission between the 220 kV bus and the 23 kV bus, the expansions of that system are only triggered because of demand growth. You cannot justify an expansion because it is efficient to install a PV power plant there. It won't happen because of the law. Distribution network, the same thing. You can only install distributed generation where there is available capacity, but the distribution operator, they don't need to upgrade the system to accommodate efficient generation. It's not a requirement for that. So when you go and you need an upgrade, you have to pay it yourself, but the system operator won't do it in a co-optimized way with all the resources involved. So it's going to be higher cost, of course. Also, the DERs in general, although this changed a few months ago, they have limited access to wholesale markets. So if you are a small battery or a small PV power plant, you didn't have access to the ancillary service market, to the spot energy market. You have to go through those markets through a trader, which is a generation company. But now they open some spaces for ancillary services, especially. Right? And other challenges in Chile, these are particular for Chile, are information transparency. So every time you want to install DG, there's no way to see if there's available capacity in the feeder. So you cannot log in on a website or see a heat map of where to install, which is what happens in California, for example. You have to ask the company. The company will run a study, will tell you a couple of months later there's this capacity available. You can contest that. They'll run again, and by then, 6 months later, the customer that you was willing to install, they say, okay, I don't want to. Right? Too much trouble for this. There's also a challenge in education and finance. Education, because when you ask people whether they want to install, like it may seem very basic question, but they won't know if the electricity produced is the same quality or has some special characteristic, right? It's a very basic question, right? Also, financing. Most of the people, even when they have money in the bank, and this is a very profitable investment because they will get the money back earlier, they won't do it because of these educational barriers, but also mainly people for whose this investment is efficient, they won't do it because they don't have the upfront payment. Right? There are some programs in the US, and I think in some places in Europe they are implementing as well, which are called the PACE program. It's property assessed clean energy programs, where you can get a loan and then the monthly payments go in the property tax. So when you sell the tax, you sell it with the debt, right? Which is a good alternative, because when you own a home, you're not sure whether to invest in something that's going to last 20 years, that's going to pay it over 15 years, but maybe you will move in 5 years from now, right? And there's a lack of a system-wide strategy and targets for integrating renewables, which is something that we want to push forward with this study. I think it's happening with the current government, we think. So summary of results, we observed in the base case up to 40% of all new generation might be distributed in Chile between 2020 and 2040, if we remove the barriers for their efficient development. If we force them to 100% of the hosting capacity, is the same cost, and it can represent nearly 60% of all the new generation in the planning horizon. The large penetration of storage that we observe in the case studies can also change a much higher hosting capacity, but also much higher value of this resource. Because in all these analyses, we didn't even touch the fact that having storage and local energy production can give you a much higher resiliency, which is of course one of the objectives of climate change adaptation, is to be able to persist in the energy supply against massive disturbances. So we didn't account for the fact that we can have a much higher reliability level with storage and local production, and that also has some monetary value. The results suggest that massive integration of DERs in Chile can happen without can happen by private initiative, without a significant state intervention in terms of subsidies or money or tax credits. But it has to, we have to adjust our market design so that the adequate price signals reach the decision makers. Right? And something that's happening right now in Chile, for example, is that we are installing a cross subsidy of tariffs between large consumers. Like large consumers will pay more, so that small consumers pay less. And that's very against the risk, right? We have to pass the price, the real price, to consumers so that they can make the decision. At least the ones that can make the decision of investing in this kind of products, right? Vulnerable families is a different thing. But if something has the resources to make a decision on investing on this, it's better to pass the actual cost of electricity. Okay, so there are certain specific barriers that need to be addressed by the state in order to overcome and to allow the efficient development of DGs. That's the presentation. Thank you very much. Yes.
So, that is prediction of how the system will work in terms of it allows you to tell how price might change supply or the features of the system.
Yes, it's not direct, but once you have the resources that are going to be present each year, we can run a much higher detailed simulation of the operation and take the dual variable of the demand supply balance, right, which is the price. And that's a very good proxy to the actual spot market price that we should observe that time, which is the spot market price, right, which might go down to zero if it's all renewable. So the long-term price, which is set by the licitaciones, tenders, long-term tenders for energy supply of residential and commercial consumers, those won't go down to zero because those have to pay operational and investment costs, right? So just by looking at the results, you can see that the prices should be around $50 per megawatt hour because you have to pay for the renewables, the transmission, and storage.
Right. And you can so look at if you could maintain the prices of natural gas or oil and see maybe the difference between like the price of electricity, see how they get close. Like things so far, like in terms of EQ, electricity is the most expensive one compared to like the other fuels. Could you be able to predict with this new slide if it gets closer to these fuels?
I don't think I have an answer for that. I think I'll have to think more about it. I guess we can, like, once we have the state of the system at each particular year, I think we can make all those predictions. But I don't know how easy would it be from the results to extrapolate to those parameters that you mentioned.
So, is there any particular reason for why results like this should not be generalizable? I mean, is there something specific about Chile that's different? Or can I take this idea, which is, distributed generation in a place even where the costs of centralized generation are really falling, has a lot of additional benefits in terms of costs, just because it's locally more efficient. You have less transmission costs and so on. Is that a generalizable insight from this model, or is there something more specific to the Chilean case that?
I think there are factors that favor the case for Chile, but some of them make it more difficult even. So maybe those average and we can generalize, but the Chilean case is very specific because the cheap resource is far away from the load center, so that favors distributed generation. The plant factor in the cities is not that bad. I mean, is maybe as good as all the other countries that with good PV potential in Santiago. So in the Atacama Desert, you get the best low plant factor in the world. But then in Santiago, you get the second best. It's not that bad, right? And then even in Concepcion as well. So so that works also in favor of DG. What works against is that our distribution system is very cheap because it's not that reliable and it's all overhead lines. So in order to include more distributed generation, you have to upgrade our distribution system. And that's an additional cost in the case of Chile. Not so in Australia, for example, or in California, or in UK, or in Canada, where you have much stronger, much higher cost as well, distribution systems. But that means that you don't have to upgrade, to invest so much on upgrades to accommodate this, right? So I can see factors in both directions. My impression is that we won't see the same results everywhere. I think the fact that we have this extraordinary renewable potential in cities and the alternative ways to transport them thousands of kilometers makes the case for Chile.
Broader question about sort of the extent to which climate change is part of these debates within Chile, or how much of it is just autonomous, presence of the resource and sort of, private investment.
Well, we have discussed a lot in Chile about climate change, but all that has happened because of private decision. Right? The government hasn't put in place a plan where we invest state money to promote certain technology over another because we decided that it's the best for climate change. That hasn't happened.
So these are private producer groups that are making investments in this.
Yeah, this has all happened by private decision. Which is good in a sense, like the potential in Chile is so good that you don't have to, like so far. But I think we're getting to a point where we might need that, especially for distributed generation to happen, at least at the beginning, to overcome this inertia of not having
The transmission and distribution these are sort of state regulated monopolies. Is that the structure for the T&D as well? Who's going to make the investments in transmission? Who's going to actually, how does that look like?
So it's a mixed market. So it's a monopoly once you get the tender, right? So the transmission is centrally planned. The National Energy Commission decides which lines need to be built according to a model that approximates the cost of that investment. Once it's decided, it calls for a tender. The winner builds and operates the line forever. Right, so and there are some smaller transmission assets where they don't tender, they just give it to the large provider that is right next to it, because it's of course going to be cheaper for them to operate.
It is a wholesale electricity market, though, right?
In terms of generation, yes,
Yeah.
it's a wholesale electricity market. It's a pool-based market.
Okay.
With it's called price is equal to the marginal cost.
Yeah,
We don't have beats, right, which is
Yeah.
determine the cost based on a cost function for each generation company. But the decision to enter the market is private.
So the power bid, I guess you guys had like long-term power bids for renewables or no?
We have, like, for regulated consumers,
Yeah.
in distribution companies, we call for long-term tenders of 20 years of supply of energy. And then, but that's a financial contract. So you produce, I'll pay you. If you actually produce the energy at the time I need it or not, it's your problem. If you have to buy it in the wholesale energy market, that's at your cost. I'll pay you whatever we agreed for 20 years.
Yeah, there's a guaranteed price,
It's a financial long-term contract. Yeah.
and it's different for every technology.
Well, they all go to the same tender, but there are some design decisions that we made in the tender so that renewables get benefited, because we separate the bids in different time frames. So there's a time of the day where solar is producing from 8 a.m. till 4. There's block hours where, of course, we will get very cheap prices from renewable, because they don't get the risk of having to sell energy at night where they don't produce it and they have to buy it at the spot market.
And have you guys had like congestion incidents like from all these new plants?
All the time, yeah.
time.
We have a congestion now that's gonna make prices for several hours in the north zero for 2 or 3 years more.
But you don't get negative prices though. That's not how the market works.
We cannot, because we don't have like, in order to have negative prices, you need somebody to bid negative, or in the case of Chile, to have a cost function that goes to negative.
Yeah.
We don't have any of those.
But
Because they don't bid.
you do curtail when you get into the congestion.
You curtail.
Okay.
You curtail, and you try to curtail everybody the same amount over the year. but it won't really matter because even if they don't curtail you, you are selling your energy at a price of zero, so it doesn't really matter. But many companies are like, for example, there's a pilot project that wants to produce green hydrogen in the north of Chile. And they are going in a partnership with one of these power production companies because they are basically throwing money at zero price many hours of the day. And if this investment can be done fast, they can get the benefits of the curtailment.
Yeah.
But like it is efficient in a system like in any system. As you plan it, it is always going to be efficient to have a certain level of curtailment because you won't want to build the extra megawatt of transmission line to produce this 1 hour of peak that happens once a year. So I guess the level of curtailment we have in Chile is not efficient now. It is because of this constant travel of transmission following generation, and then generation you take 3 years to build, transmission takes 10 years to build, so you can never match them one-to-one at any particular time. And because of that also, well, that's another point for distributed generation, right? You don't have to build transmission lines, which are, some of them takes 12 years, and then people, like, they ask for more money because the tender went so wrong that they are gonna go bankruptcy and get help. Like, it's a whole trouble to build large transmission lines. They take a lot of time. People face the winner's course, it's called. When you go so cheap that you get the bid, you win the tender, but then you don't want to build it. You went too low.
But the distributed decision is, I mean, so in California, they've decided that all new housing should have rooftops.
Yeah.
So that then has the potential for creating sort of aggregation. Whereas at the individual level, it's just individuals making choices, right?
Yes.
And that's it seems to be a harder thing to do until you get to some kind of a tipping point.
Yeah. In Chile, we cannot go that far to demand houses to have the rooftop, but the Ministry of Housing is thinking about having all new houses solar ready, which means all the
Structural.
tubes, all the structure can support the panels, and you don't have to drill anything because all the conduit is there.
I'm wondering if, so do you guys in Chile, like the centers of high demand, like is industry like pretty much all around the ports in the country, or is it like concentrated in the north? Or
Well, the main industry in Chile, as you may know, is mining, and that's all concentrated in the very two or three spots along the country, mainly in the north. And then the second largest, I guess, we have wood. We call madera.
wood?
Lumber. Yeah, lumber industry. That's also a large consumption, but they also co-generate because of all the
all the wood pellets and stuff.
Yeah, so they are large consumers, but also large producers. And then agricultural facilities, they also consume a large amount towards the south. I think it's very local, like focused on specific areas. We don't have industry all around the country. It's very focused.
Yeah, in Mexico, we have it mainly on the north, like close to the US border, and in the center of the country. And the rest is, like, the consumption is just very different. So that's another challenge for transmission. You have most of your like renewable coming from the south where there's not high demand, and it's kind of challenging.
Yeah, it's crazy why that happened, because we decided where to put the industry long before we thought about using renewables, but then they happen to be very far.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. You also ran off this.